For thousands of years, elders and knowledge keepers have used stories to educate future generations. Stories and words can help heal our hearts and make Mother Earth a better place for all people. This is Healing Hearts.
Welcome to Healing Hearts. We are on location at the beautiful St. Patel Park as things are slowly opening up. Way back in January, though, we started Healing Hearts in partnership with Immigration Partnership Winnipeg and knowledge keeper Clayton Sandy. Well, fast forward to 7 months later and almost 11 shows, we are now going to take time to reflect on what our favorite Healing Hearts moment was. So I will be speaking with Clayton Sandy and Hani Ataan Ubeady. He is the Executive Director for Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. But first, let's head back to the Hughes studio where I spoke with Jamie Banias, who is part of the team as well. And we hear what her favorite moment was on Healing Hearts.
My favorite episode is the episode on reconciliation that it just recently aired a month ago.
When we watched the movie Saturday nights would be cowboys and Indians, and we would cheer for the Indians, of course, because that's who we are. But we didn't know they were white people, done up in brown. But we would cheer for them, and we cheered for them probably for the first 3 or 4 years. Those were our people. We don't want to see them being killed, but yes, they were. So when the white man won, it was a victory. When the Indian won, it was a massacre. So it's whoever tells the story. And so I don't know what year, 3rd year, 4th year, we started cheering for the white guys, the cowboys. They were the good guys. So we turned on ourselves. And that's what happened to Indigenous people because they began to believe the lies because of truth. Truth, okay? Because number one, first of all, our ancestors would never think for 1 minute that anybody coming on their land is going to lie to them. Why would you lie?
The story that Belinda told about residential schools and the children watching the Cowboys and Indians movies every Saturday night and how they learned to stop cheering for the Indians because the Cowboys were the good guys. And I've never heard the intergenerational impacts of residential school said in such a clear way that it's really touched my heart. But to think about an entire generation of children being taught to stop cheering for themselves, and then to think of those children growing up and what they taught their children, and then those children growing up and what they taught their children, and it really starts to put into perspective what has happened over the years.
I loved all the shows, and like I told you before, I liked the one also too with the women. But the one that really struck a nerve with me was the one with Albert McLeod, the LGBTQ community, and that was really interesting because I to be honest, I haven't really had an opportunity to actually sit and listen to other people from different nationalities that are part of that community.
Can you maybe talk about Two-Spirited People, from an Indigenous culture point of view?
Well, what we know in the various languages of the different tribal groups that existed here at the time of contact, within those, and there was 1,000 languages here, so that really talked to the long habitation of humans to develop over 1,000 distinct languages. Well, what we know from the sort of historians is that there was 156 Indigenous words or terms that describe gay people or trans people. So it really was the extent of that inclusion. And as well, we know with the Indian residential school era, that was an attempt to force Christianity onto Indigenous minds, particularly children. So in that era, which was over 100 years, there was really no space for gay people, right? Because children were sort of socialized to be heterosexual, and that was the only acceptable identity. So it was about spirit, right? And so prior to contact with the Europeans, Indigenous people would have spirit names, right? Or they would practice a particular spirituality depending on their culture. And so in the erasure of Indigenous gay people, it was kind of an erasure of spirituality, right? And that representation or that link to our natural world, the link to our community. So it really wasn't erase us. So in our resurgence in the last 40 years, it is about reclaiming our spiritual identity, our relationship to the natural world, our relationship to the Indigenous spiritual world, and then our relationship to our families and our relationship to our communities and nations. So that's kind of where the spirit comes into the larger conversation around the broader LGBTQ community, because that's a very political term, right? In terms of the liberation movement in the 60s and 70s, where spirituality was not much of that conversation then. And I think for us as Indigenous gay people, it's our contribution to the movement. And I like to characterize it like we were the first gays of America, right? Thousands of years ago, right?
Yeah, just so it's kind of, you know, it's not surprising, but it's just interesting just to hear from other nationalities, like an East Indian person. I've talked to a Chinese person before, and a non-native person, and somebody. And I have in the past. We've done a couple other projects with a couple of Indigenous men that have made the transfer also too, who come to some of our conferences also too. But it's nice to actually just, you know, just to hear someone's story, and just to hear, just to feel the link of how racism is the same with everybody. It doesn't matter what color you are, and like in his community, again, it's people from all different nationalities and colors, and it just seems like the brush is painted with all of them also too. And so that kind of surprises me or interests me also too, because I'm not used to white people going after white people, you know, and you know, being racist towards each other, right? And that's always been kind of new to me, and so it's kind of weird. Yeah. So that was one that kind of touched me, and just to hear people, just to hear some of their own stories, and how I guess it's like, you know, because we're Indigenous, we're Canadians in North America. It's nice for me to hear other people from around the world that suffer the same issues and the same racism and the same labels and the same hatred.
Intergenerational trauma. That means the situation that we're dealing with, it's not necessarily an Indigenous issue. It is the whole country issue. It's our issue as well. And so the intergenerational trauma that impacted generations from the Indigenous communities, it also now impacting us. We are kind of secondhand exposed to it. And there's a second layer of trauma. And so we need first to recognize that this is actually the case. We need to validate that this has happened. But also we need to recognize the impact of the intergenerational trauma and what it means. But also the larger society deserves to know these stories that are associated with the intergenerational trauma. Because with that, it comes clarity, with that comes sharing of perspectives, and with that comes solidarity and support. And without knowing and understanding what intergenerational trauma is and what impact had created, we would always have half-truth or half-told stories. And also, we would not be able to stop our judgmental position on the issue, because we always judge by what we see now, but we don't know what drove what we see now to the situation that it is now. Would it impact only Indigenous people, or would it impact us as Canadians in general. First, we need to validate the space, to create the space, safe space for that understanding to happen. First, that Indigenous people have gone through intergenerational trauma. And once that is done, then we go back to ourselves and ask, what does that really mean to us in our daily life? Are we going to live our life business as usual? Or are we going to change our perspectives? And I think that is essential for us to have deep, sincere thinking. And so the intergenerational trauma, it is essential, very important for Canadians to understand. And also once we understand it fully, then the Indigenous peoples in Canada would recognize that we at least moved from the position of not knowing to position of curiosity to the step of understanding, and then hopefully we will have the proper empathy towards this specific item or issue. And I think the larger society also deserve to understand that. And for that reason, I felt everything is connected to that specific subject, because residential schools and the impact of residential schools, it needs to be understood from the perspective of intergenerational trauma. It did not impact the generation that went to school only, but also the following and the other generations that came after, and their children, and so on and so forth. So for that reason, I felt it is more than important for us to start at least thinking and exploring this specific subject.
You're going to run into some people that will be very racist, and I also had some pretty racist hockey teammates over the past couple of years I've been playing, so it hasn't been too great with some coaches and obviously players, so yeah.
What did you do to sort of, I guess, overcome it? Have you, kind of maybe words of advice, because there's probably a lot of other young players out there too, Karen, that are probably facing the same thing you are.
I just learned how to ignore it and obviously give them a piece of my mind. So,
with respect to the work of the Indigenous engagement work, or the Indigenous and Newcomer engagement work, I see it as a must type of work. I have started the work on creating projects within my current job as a director of IPW, or Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. I make sure that the projects are based on actual needs, and the needs are identified by our Indigenous partners and community members. It's not necessarily us driving the process of identifying needs within this specific work. We started in 2014. We moved in 2016 with research to identify those needs. We created a space where Indigenous and Newcomer researchers worked on this specific need, and that is the need of creating, finding solutions for the gap that exists between the two communities. In 2018, we established an additional structure to IPW, and that is the Indigenous Consultation Circle. Before then, we have established dedicated sector table that we call Indigenous and Newcomer Engagement Sector Table, consists of newcomers and Indigenous members to explore ideas, projects that bring the two communities together in terms of understanding, but also in terms of sharing commonalities and inspire to do future work. And then we went even further, and we recognized it through the research that I referred to earlier, and we found out that there is actual gap that exists between the two communities, and this gap is driven or fueled by misconception, misunderstanding, myths, and stereotypes, ill-informed opinions, all of that type of thing that needed to be dealt with. And for that, we found out that there's a need for an actual, effective, practical orientation that can allow an opportunity of learning to the newcomers upon arrivals, but also to the staff that work with the newcomers throughout the settlement sector. And we got funding from the Government of Canada specifically from Canadian heritage. And through that funding, we focus on creating an orientation toolkit, Indigenous orientation toolkit. And this is a very unique process. And I think it is probably the first of its own kind that exists in our country. And then the process of developing the Indigenous orientation toolkit, it's really led by Indigenous members. And the consultation is originated and inspired by Indigenous ideas and thinking. Even the contents of the themes within the Indigenous orientation toolkit, it's also developed by Indigenous curriculum developers. We are now in almost halfway through, I would say, if not more than halfway, of completing this Indigenous orientation toolkit. I can tell you now that we have 7 themes, main themes within the Indigenous orientation toolkit. 4 of them at least, I can say for now, that they have been completed. And that means we have few left, less than half. And I'm very confident that we will meet our target by March 31st of 2022. My hope is we're going to have this Indigenous orientation toolkit completed. Then it will be shared throughout the settlement sector, and my hope the new director of Immigration Partnership Winnipeg, since I'm leaving in 6 days from now, but I'm not leaving the subject, nor the project, nor my principles that attach to the work that I have been doing throughout the years. I'm very certain that the leadership at Social Planning Council, Immigration Partnership Winnipeg, will carry on with the good work and complete this project. This project is not only a project with phases, but it is an invitation and opportunity to invite all community members, not only Newcomer and Indigenous members, but also the larger society. My hope is this work will continue, get supported, and it goes beyond the targeted audience. So for that reason, I want to say thank you for allowing us to have our voice travel beyond our meetings and gatherings and events, and allowing us a platform where we can share with the rest of the society. My hope is one day to see conversations of reconciliation around the tables. I would love to see signs of reconciliation work in different parts of our country, and it is an invitation for all of us as Canadians to think positively about our future. And let's create that space for Indigenous people to lead the process.
I guess it's my turn now to pick my favorite moment, and it was truly very hard. There have been so many, but the one show that really had an impact on me was the mental health one. And in this particular moment, Mariko Sumi, a beautiful Japanese-Canadian girl from Ottawa, opens up about what it's like living with autism.
I'm a Japanese Canadian born from my mom's French Canadian, my dad's Japanese immigrant from Japan. This part that was a newborn child, was very energetic, enthusiastic. What I noticed on my first day of school, kindergarten 1, because in Ontario we have two kindergarten classes. And on my first class, my teacher, my parents, even my classmates, they noticed that I have some particularities as a child compared to those of my age group, such as I couldn't talk, I couldn't interact with other people, I couldn't follow a regular class correctly as well. So I had to get my first diagnostic at the Children's Hospital in my city in Ottawa. And I got my first diagnostic at 4 years old of autism. Back then, it was only autism shortly. As like the definition that you see in the movie Raymond with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman. It wasn't autism spectrum disorder back then. So I had to change school for being in a special needs class. It was very difficult because I had to change school because that area, there's so many school closing. Just to let you know, I went to a French school. Yeah, there's so many school closing in this area, this Ottawa. And I've been to bullying and racism, discrimination to my cultural heritage. For example, in grade school, because as a child, I grew up with Japanese food and Japanese TV show, like a popular TV show called Okasan Toy Show. I grew up with the music that play on the show, there's some animation series that play on TV. And it was hard for me to share my own interest, my common interest with my classmates, because most of them were white, like 96% white in my class. So I was the only Asian person in my classmates that were more familiar compared to me than with American pop culture such as Backstreet Boys. And I was very lonely. Same in high school, it was very difficult. Wasn't the typical 2000 girly girl that didn't. I was very culturally different from others. I didn't have the common interests nor the same opinions, the same point of view of these people. But since even grade school, because I noticed one other particularity compared to most my friends were severe autistic. I wasn't that severe. I could concentrate, like I could do my own thing. I could read, I could write, I could even type my own computer as well.
I want to thank Clayton, Hani, and Jamie for joining me today on this reflective show for Healing Hearts. Stay tuned. On July 28th, we'll have a brand new show talking about anti-racism in sport. So stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you next time on Healing Hearts.